So before we dive into talking about some of the post-flop stuff, I actually wanted to have one more conversation on the way that I approach post-flop and just more of like a theory standpoint. I guess we talked a little bit more about the exploitative standpoint in the last video. But when we look at betting post-flop, when we look at being the aggressor, we always want to try and start off with a range of hands that is a smaller subset of our whole range, that when we bet, we then look to barrel at a fairly high frequency. And the reason that you want to be barreling at a high frequency is because by doing so, you do not allow your opponent the opportunity to float you. Now, there is another way to play it, and I think this is actually something that we're seeing more nowadays. There's two different styles. Let's talk about c-betting and single raise pots. There's two different styles that are starting to become more prominent these days. There's a continuation bet frequency of around 50-ish%, planning on barreling 60-65% on both the turn and the river, with the idea being by the river, you are adequately balanced between bluffs and value to where your opponent's not able to do anything about it. If they call, they'll break even with their stronger hands. And if they call with their light hands, depending on removal, it might be break even or losing, etc. So basically, that's the style I've always employed. And nowadays, we're starting to see the rise of a style that has a much higher flop c-bet frequency, like more like 70 or 80%, and then a very low turn bet, like 25, 30%, 35%. But the thing about this strategy is it works because by betting that frequently on the flop and that low on the turn, you're going to have to defend the turn checks, but your turn checking range is actually fairly well balanced with a lot of hands that are betting the flop to call river, with the occasional strong hands that are going to raise facing a bet. So while that strategy is certainly one that you can employ, that's not the way that I've ever played the game. And frankly, I don't even think that it's necessary to have a very solid winning strategy. I've always based my play around trying to play in the parts of the tree that when I check, I can have a balanced range of hands, right? But once you start betting in any spot, this is actually the number one thing I wanted to just quickly say before we got into too much post-flop stuff. In any situation, when you start betting on an earlier street, you should look to barrel at a high frequency, because by doing so, you don't allow your opponent the opportunity to float you with non-equity hands. And I know that we constantly go back to the non-equity thing because, when you play heads up, you have to always be worried about, can my opponent bluff me without equity? Because if they can, you're going to get run over. So, maybe that's just like manifesting itself across a lot of different things that I talk about. But it is important because the moment your opponent can do things without equity, then it becomes very tough for you. To win the battle because they can just win so many hands. I've played many opponents in my career where I was playing them and then I ran the calcs on how much equity I had to call their flop bet. And there's a lot of opponents out there where it ended up being around 0%. So when I looked at my big blind strategy, generally speaking, I think folding the flop to c-bet, I think that's like the worst place to fold because you have so much equity you can still realize. You get so many opportunities to bluff. There's a lot of good things that can happen when you float a flop c-bet. But the thing is, if they barrel at a high frequency, it takes away that ability to do so. There are a lot of players that have had high c-bets, low turn c-bet, and then high river fold to probe. And when that's the case, you can just float anything on the flop and you're totally fine. So the way I'm going to teach you guys, it's a more, traditional style of how to play poker correctly. We start with a lower bet on any street. On any street we start betting, we're going to be like betting 30, 40, 50%, and looking to barrel at 60 to 70% follow-up. So whenever we're talking about flop bets, we should be kind of visualizing the way that we're going to be barreling turns and rivers, the kinds of hands we're going to pick for those decisions, and how we're going to be playing the later streets. Now, I will say that it is okay, especially when you look out of position spots. I think that's what most strikes me as being the case. But when you look at a lot of out of position spots, it can be okay to bet the flop like 40 or 50%, and then your turn barrel ends up being kind of low because the way the board changes often, you need to do a lot of checking. And the best example of that would be, let's say you 3-bet and your opponent calls, and you decide to continuation bet on 9-8-6. Well, if the turn is a 10, 7, 5, 9, 8, maybe 6, depending on their preflop range, you're going to have to do a lot of checking, if not all checking in the big blind, because you simply don't have a lot of those hands in your range, particularly on the straight cards. So in those spots, you have to be checking with a lot of hands in order to allow yourself, or all your hands, in order to allow yourself the ability to play against a bet. Now, you're going to have to fold exploitably, but the thing is, you know that this card is a lot better for your opponent than it is for you. And I guess that's another thing that I want to say here as well. First thing, when we start betting, we're generally going to continue to barrel, not so much that our opponent can exploit us by trapping, but enough to deny them equity to deny them the ability to float with low equity hands. And when a card comes that's a lot better for our opponent's range than ours, we're going to make sure to fold more than we would normally, because it's okay to allow them non-equity bluffs when their range is a lot stronger. And as a simple example, let's say that your opponent opens and you call, and the flop is king, queen, 10. And it checks down to the river, and the river is a jack. Well, in that spot, both players are going to have an ace quite frequently, but the small blind will have even more ace X's than the big blind, because almost all of those hands are likely checking down to the river, and the big blind is going to be 3-betting a lot of their strong ace X's pre, that the small blind will be more likely to have. So in that spot, it makes a lot more sense for the big blind to check fold 50-55%, unless for whatever reason you have knowledge on the way your opponent's playing that they're going to have less ace X's. So there are spots where you can fold exploitably, allowing your opponent profitable bluffs with no equity. But I wanted to just give you kind of that overview for the way we're going to approach it, and the way we're going to build our counter strategies, and the way we're going to kind of, I guess from a theory standpoint, how we choose bets and how we're going to play those later streets.